Hello everyone, welcome to yet another day in this Decline decade, the decade where things are only going to get worse before they get better. Awful lot to get through today, so we're just going to jump into it. Reform published a statement straight to Twitter yesterday, just in the afternoon, and it turns out the independent Casey investigation that they paid for has been completed. And this is what they had to say. Following complaints received from two women about the misconduct of Mr. Lowe and members of his male staff, Reform UK appointed an independent Casey to investigate the matter. Her report is now complete. Now, for those of you outside of the UK, a King's Counsel is a barrister who is the equivalent to a senior lawyer, has qualifications that frankly would be under risk should she be lying at any point in her report, and would be risking her lifelong career as a barrister and never be able to work in law again should she be found to be lying. In other words, she is highly incentivised to not lie. I have already seen people trying to claim that she was paid by Reform UK and so she is giving them the conclusion that they want. I'm not buying that personally, and I am fed up of copes along those lines. It is completely standard to hire someone to do an investigation into bullying allegations in jobs, and Reform UK actually decided to get someone very senior to do it, which is probably sensible because someone very senior would have an awful lot more to lose, again should they be lying. So, in summary, the independent KC has found that there to be credible evidence of unlawful harassment of two women by Mr. Lowe and male members of his team. So Mr. Lowe was involved in the bullying, as it turns out. We'll get into detail of it, don't worry. Contrary to Mr. Lowe's public statements, one of the women's allegations were made against Mr. Lowe himself. One of the women received threats that Mr. Lowe would take legal action against her if she cooperated with the investigation. We'll get into that in more detail. That's not entirely fair to say from Reform UK, as the woman has only claimed that she received threats that Mr. Lowe would take legal action. As far as I can tell, there was no substantial evidence beyond her word for that. Both women gave their statements to the KC as sworn statements under penalty of perjury. Mr. Lowe has refused to do the same. Both women lodged formal complaints with the ICGS, which is the Parliamentary Independent Watchdog into Workplace Problems. And that was done in January. Reform UK will cooperate fully with their investigation. In the interest of transparency, we publish the full report here. And it's important to note that because independent complaints were made to the ICGS, Reform UK are liable for anything that they find. And if they are found to have not dealt with this situation properly, there are technically unlimited fines that can be put on them by Parliament. This is why they have been very robust like this. This is why they hired a KC, because they do not want any of this legal trouble that can be thrown at them from Parliament. From what I can tell, and people I know in the legal business, this is all bog standard, and as far as they can tell, Reform have not acted in a way that's unreasonable. So basic introductions to start off with. Asked by Reform UK to look into allegations made by two employees who worked in the parliamentary office for Mr. Lowe or in his constituency office, and she's established that she is no part of any political party and has no preconceptions or bias whatsoever into the case. And basically she has to say that because an awful lot of information and opinion has been put out to social media and the press. Mostly, obviously, by one of the parties here. So now we get into the timeline of events, which, from what I can tell, it's been all over the place when it comes to claims of the timeline, so it's good that we finally have an official record of it. So the report arises out of complaints that emanated initially directly from woman A to Mr. Lowe on the 18th of December 2024 about bullying and unacceptable conduct from a particular individual in the constituency office. She also formally made her complaint to the Parliamentary Independent Complaints and Grievance Scheme, initially contacted the scheme on the 17th of January 2025, and then a formal complaint was sent on the 28th. It's also correct to record that Woman A complaints were made directly in respect of conduct of Mr. Lowe toward her, as well as his staff, while Woman B made direct complaints against the constituency or male staff, but indirectly against Mr. Lowe. Woman A reached out to the party chairman by email on the 27th of February 2025, generally setting out her grievances, which is in line with what Reform have claimed. Woman B has made a formal complaint to the ICGS on the 2nd of February 2025, and she too contacted the party chairman by email to complain about bullying on the 27th of February 2025. Interesting that they both decided to do it on the same day, I will say that much. Whether that's coincidence, whether they both were in talk with each other, they were both in different offices, so I can't really see that, or whether Reform even reached out to them to say, can you make official complaints, please? I don't know, and we don't know. All three are possibilities. Which is most likely? Probably about equal that they did it independently and Reform asked them to. I will put it that way. It's also worth mentioning at this point that Rupert Lowe claims that the interview with the Daily Mail was conducted on the 25th of February. This is also being said by the actual author of the interview and subsequent article. Again, as I've said it before, I don't know why you'd wait 2 weeks to release that, but that's apparently what happened. Following the emails from the two women sent on the 27th of February, which have clearly raised complaints of bullying by Mr. Lowe and those in his constituency office, that on the 28th of February, the party wrote directly to Mr. Lowe requesting his cooperation in an independent investigation. By this letter, he was informed that the party had received evidence of bullying, discriminatory behaviour, misuse of disciplinary procedures, and concerns about behaviour toward female staff. It is right to point out that the party has been sent both the formal complaint from Woman A to the ICGS and certain WhatsApp messages that have been written by Mr. Lowe's constituency manager about Woman A. I will mention at this point I might get Woman A and Woman B mixed up, their names are redacted after all, but I'm trying to give you the best rundown of events here that I can. Either way, this is going to be where the credible evidence comes from, the WhatsApp messages, because they are pretty hard to fake. Both these complaints were raised by both women prior to any disciplinary procedure set in motion by Mr. Lowe against each of them, which is contrary to what Mr. Lowe has claimed on Twitter before, that actually they were making these complaints in reaction to disciplinary procedures. No, according to the timeline, it's the opposite. They made the complaints first. Woman A had, as stated, made an informal complaint to Mr. Lowe as early as December 2024 and a formal complaint on the 14th of January, whilst Woman B had lodged her complaint on the 4th of February 2025, as set out above. Woman A's disciplinary hearing, described as probationary hearing, took place on the 28th of January, so that was definitely before either the official complaint or the informal complaint to Lowe. Any suggestion from Mr. Lowe that he has made in the media that these women complained following instigation of disciplinary proceedings against either of them is incorrect, and in the case of Woman A, demonstrably so. Both women complained of considerable stress and suffering following details of alleged sustained bullying and discriminatory conduct, and they each raised concerning issues of the impact upon their health and well-being. I was approached and asked to look at these matters by Reform on the 3rd of March 2025. And just to quickly go into this is a massive problem I've been having with Rupert Lowe for the past 2 weeks. He's mouthing off on Twitter constantly, can't even keep his story straight there. And I suspected this would happen in the end. As it turns out, a load of his claims are going to turn out to be nonsense, and it's going to be pointed out in this report. This is exactly why you don't start trying to make a narrative of your own on social media. I've seen this happen so many times that someone gets accused, starts getting overly defensive in public, and it all comes back to bite them. Best example I can think of is Carl Benjamin's court case with Akila, obviously. He was mouthing off on Twitter defensively for years, really, and then in the court case it all came back to bite her. Same's going to happen with Lowe, and it is not the conduct I would expect from a professional businessman. I'm shocked, if anything, that that's the route he's gone down. So she then goes into a methodology of investigation and claims that Reform told her, effectively, this is your investigation, do what you think is best. And part of the conclusion they wanted was, effectively, what can Reform, or what do you recommend Reform actually do to effectively not have this problem again? And this is what she stated in an email. My assessment requires a careful collation of all evidence and allegations to determine generally whether there was or is any conduct that occurred that could be characterised as, or could have been construed as, a culture of bullying or harassment, encouraged or tolerated within the hierarchy of the party, emanating from Mr. Lowe and impacting upon his constituency, which Mr. Whedon and his chairman, alternatively, whether the allegations are simply not made out, and what has been characterised as bullying or harassment, have been failures or misconduct on the part of employees who have responded badly to justified criticisms of their work. Fair enough. 2, specifically, whether any of the allegations could be made out, or given the wide remit of the Equality Act 2010, it is an absolutely ridiculous piece of legislation, by the way, one with such a wide net, pretty much anything could come under it. And as I say, breaking the Equality Act in the workplace environment could put unlimited fines on the company, or in this case, the political party. That's why they're taking it so seriously, because they don't want to be drained dry. 3. Any consequences of my assessment. Or 4. Recommend to avoid any such allegations being made for the future, if at all possible. All seems reasonable to me. I don't particularly see any reason why she would not do this job properly. So this email followed an originating email both to Mr. Lowe and Mr. Jonathan Whedon. In that email I had explained carefully my independence and lack of any political connection to Reform, or indeed any other political party. To date, Mr. Whedon has failed entirely to respond in any way to my request for him to engage in this process. That ain't good. I did have a number of exchanges and conversations with Mr. Lowe, one of which led to some misunderstanding about what was said by me, which had to be corrected by me in a public statement. I made clear this affects the report in no way at all. However, I do think it is humiliating for Rupert Lowe that he had to be corrected by the KC, and as the KC even pointed out, as I've gone through before, it's highly unusual. This again is why you do not mouth off in public when you are being investigated. It makes you look like an idiot. So additionally, there was a good deal of public pronouncements which seemed to shed rather more heat than light on my job, and which, with these, pertain to events and or incidents which are unconnected with the specificity of this report, I have ignored. Again, this is why I think Reform hired her, because she's clearly very professional. I informed Mr. Lowe on more than one occasion that I was proposing first to interrogate the complaints by taking careful and full statements from each woman, and he would then be able to see and respond to them. I reached out to each woman and arranged telephonic interviews with each of them. From Monday 10 March, I embarked upon the exercise of bespeaking the information that I was required. I spoke at length with the two complainants, Woman A and Woman B, on entirely separate days and occasions as arranged between us, based upon what I had been told, and then prepared full statements on behalf of each of these women. So these statements were made, and amendments also made for any part that didn't make sense or weren't accurate, etc. And this took 4 days. And then on the 14th of March, she sent the completed and signed statements respective appendices to the solicitors now appointed by Mr. Lowe, namely Mr. Jason Newell. So that's all good. We knew that Mr. Lowe had hired his own solicitor, which is fine. Mr. Newell and I had engaged directly prior to the supply of material in a professional, courteous and polite exchange, and helpfully confirmed that all the material had been received by him on the Friday, although I apprehend that it was unlikely he would be able to action this material with his client until the following Monday. And unfortunately, I have now been informed by Mr. Newell by email dated 21st of March that his client had declined to formally respond to the complaints and set forth in the statement, nor will he address the questions. So Mr. Lowe has obviously said in the past, I will not be doing anything to help this investigation, and he meant it, which I completely believed. I was informed that Mr. Lowe wants to delay any engagement with this investigation due to the complication of a further issue arising out of an alleged assault incident, which seems to have involved the police. Okay, an alleged assault incident. I thought they were just threats. But now, whether she's made a mistake there or something, I don't know. It seems to have escalated to an actual alleged assault, which isn't what Reform UK have said, so it'll be interesting to see what happens there. In turn, I've informed Mr. Newell that my clear instructions are to press on with this private and informal report for the party, as I set out in my email, and that I could see no nexus between allegations of bullying or harassment by the employees and any alleged criminal and potentially formal proceedings that might involve the authorities. Any delay, as suggested, was quite unacceptable. Mr. Lowe had had more time than had been taken by me to produce the material setting out the complaints, and I could see no reason why he could not formally respond. Again, I put this down to Mr. Lowe saying on Twitter he would not cooperate, and, well, he's standing by that. And the report touches upon this. Moreover, and somewhat unfortunately, Mr. Lowe made a statement on social media the day before I received the email from Mr. Newell, giving the apparent reason for Mr. Lowe not presently engaged with my review. This message made the unequivocal statement that, I've gone through this previously, effectively the complaints are vexatious and I will not be having any part of this investigation. The credible evidence line comes up there too. I've quoted in full from this message, as it provides for me the clear and unequivocal denials on the part of Mr. Lowe, which I have to take into account, as well as his assertion that the complaints were raised only in response to disciplinary issues involving both these women, which, as mentioned earlier, isn't true. This message is entirely consistent with Mr. Lowe's stance from the very start of this process, and in fairness to him, I have to give such weight to his consistent position as is due. Obviously, it would have been far preferable for me to have a clear witness statement from him signed with a statement of truth under penalty of perjury, as I've received from Women A and Women B. Regrettably, and as seen above in the timeline section, the statement put out by Mr. Lowe also misstates the fact so far as the assertion that the disciplinary proceedings preceded the complaints. Most clearly, so far as Woman A is concerned, it is also clear from the evidence of the messages being sent by John Whedon concerning Woman B, which compromised part of her complaint and upon which she relies, were being sent and disseminated far earlier than any disciplinary proceedings had begun. In short, once again, Mr. Lowe is talking nonsense. And that has been a common theme from me covering this. I keep catching Mr. Lowe in lies of his own making, or misleading the public anyway. And as I keep asking people, how can you trust a man who has such unreliable narration? He has given me far more reason to mistrust him than Reform UK. Finally, the process section finishes off with, I would have been assisted by statements from Mr. Whedon, and indeed from an Alistair Harrison, who features on both complaints and sits in the unusual position of being an independent contractor of Mr. Lowe's, who is understood to be responsible for Lowe's social media, but played, as it turned out, a large part in the matter. So Lowe has hired someone specifically to make public statements on Twitter. This might explain some of the inconsistencies we've seen. Doing the best that I can, I will now get to the matter by reference to the witness evidence of both women, so let's get into the evidence. So the two women are both highly qualified, each holding bachelor's and master's degrees from Russell Group universities. Woman A entered the political arena permanently following her degree and had a remarkably successful career for no less than 14 years, in Parliament having worked for two ministers of state in the Tory party and another member of Parliament, from which job she went to work with Mr. Lowe in his parliamentary office. She succeeded in becoming a senior parliamentary secretary and office manager before she began work with Mr. Lowe. She acquired her position with Mr. Lowe after high recommendation from her former employer, amongst others. And it's no secret that Mr. Lowe does talk to people in the Tory party, so it was probably recommended by a Tory who lost his seat. And again, 14 years experience, she clearly knows what she's doing around Parliament. And Parliament is a relatively high-pressure job. She probably knows what she's doing and is probably relatively competent. And especially coming with a recommendation, yeah, I get the feeling that she's pretty good at what she does. Woman B was employed as a caseworker in the constituency office after holding responsible and indeed vital positions for a software company and then for Norfolk Fire and Rescue Service. She was headhunted for the constituency job at Mr. Lowe's Great Yarmouth constituency. So if you get headhunted, again, you're probably pretty competent. As far as I'm concerned, both these women are good at their jobs. Each of these women were in the jobs for a mere few months, and Woman A resigned before the inevitable sacking, as she describes, whilst Woman B was actually sacked. So, now into what each woman's grievance is. Woman A sets out her full grievance in a statement attached, and I need not go into the detail. There's no attached statement to this, by the way. All we're getting so far is the report. It is sufficient for me to summarise that she states that she was subject to constant criticism, meted out unpleasantly and harshly by said Harrison, who she began to feel could not please in any way whatsoever. She felt that every step she took, every case that she dealt with, was subject to complaints from Harrison. Indeed, she cited that Jonathan Whedon, with whom she was on friendly terms with, was also very irritated and irked by Harrison's arrogation of complete control over constituency matters. This might be Woman B. The barrage of criticism, which is so alien to her earlier experiences over many years in Parliament, no, sorry, it's Woman A, doing similar work, began to have a deleterious impact upon her. When she raised concerns to Mr. Lowe before Christmas, he was merely dismissive of these. So this isn't great in two ways. One, not only is it just seems Mr. Harrison, who is above her for some reason, despite the fact he's just a social media manager, seemed to be dismissing all her experience and work arrogantly, and this was not just annoying her, but also annoying Mr. Whedon. Or at least that's what she's claiming. I think it's fair to say these are all just claims so far. So in mid-January, she approached Mr. Lowe again for a frank and concerned discussion about the impact upon her that Harrison was having. To her surprise, distress and disappointment, she claimed, met with hostility and disdain. And in fact, Mr. Lowe, she says, simply made clear that Harrison was his man, and if she didn't like it, she could make other arrangements, especially as she had been put in the black corner by Harrison, and he was not afraid to get rid of anyone. A further attempt to engage with Harrison and his assistant, Jason Porter, to clear the air was met with rudeness and aggression, and said Porter told her that no one had time for this. In the parliamentary office, Mr. Lowe's approach was that she was frozen out, refused to engage with her, or have her accompany him to meetings. That was part of her job. Again, fair to say that these are all claims. However, if these claims can be generally substantiated, yeah, this would constitute a toxic work environment. And I know people in HR, this would definitely be a HR issue. Now, you can have the opinion that it's ridiculous that this is ever a HR issue and she should just be sacked. Whatever, workers' rights and what have you. Problem is that you have to work under the law as it is now. And giving anyone the opportunity to have lawfare on your company is generally best avoided. This is why HR departments are so large these days. So from Mr. Lowe's side, there were disciplinary matters against Woman A which I've been able to consider. These comprise the drafting of employment contracts which had been completed some 5 months earlier by Woman A. The complaint seems to be that the contract allowed for a 3-month probation period, whilst the contracts for both Porter and one Katrina Harrison, wife of Alistair Harrison, allowed for 6 months. This may have been an error and a genuine mistake, given that Woman A contract was drafted some weeks apart from the others, and frankly, even if it was an intended differentiation, this might well have been considered entirely reasonable, looking at the objectively given that Woman A had years of prior experience and others had none. In other words, she's used to 3-month probation periods. So this was categorised by Mr. Lowe as deceitful, which she denied and found very hurtful. Moreover, the issue of these contracts was first raised after her complaints about Harrison, and not as suggested by Mr. Lowe before her complaint, suggesting, as he does, that she only raised complaints of bullying because of the contract issue. So yeah, just nonsense again. It's worth noting, despite allegations against Woman A of being deceitful, Mr. Lowe was ultimately responsible and did actually sign off on all the contracts. So if he didn't read it, it's his own fault. And I'm not being funny, but every time I've had a job, it's been a 3-month probation period. It's not unusual to have a 3-month probation period. And as mentioned, if Mr. Lowe just didn't read the contract, yeah, I'm not being funny, that's your own fault at that point. So then there was a second area of alleged misconduct, and this was after she accessed Mr. Lowe's private email account on the 27th of January. She exchanged information about redacted person on several calls with Mr. Wedden. A number of points are made by Woman A about this issue. That it is considered part of her job to monitor all of Mr. Lowe's email accounts, and 2, if she was not supposed to be accessing this particular account, how did she obtain and access information to the account? This can only have come from Mr. Lowe personally, since it's his personal email account. And number 3, the WhatsApp messages of that day appended to her statement show that only one call passed between herself and Mr. Wedden, not the 3 or 4 claimed by Mr. Lowe. And it is Woman A's contention that the information about blank came from Mr. Wedden and not vice versa. In other words, how could it be possibly misconduct when it's literally part of her job to monitor the emails, and how would she ever get access to that without getting the information from Mr. Lowe personally? In other words, how is this misconduct? And again, to make it absolutely clear, these are all claims by Woman A. They need to be substantiated. I do appreciate that. I have to consider A, the veracity of the complaints set against Mr. Lowe's unverified response, but also whether the way it arose even warranted disciplinary process anyway, and B, whether the way the entire interaction between herself, Harrison and Mr. Lowe amounted to harassment. It is right to record that Woman A attended the GP on more than one occasion, but declined to be signed off for health reasons until she was eventually so signed off by a doctor for stress-related symptoms. And again, Parliament is typically a high-stress environment, obviously, and she already worked there for 14 years. This kind of speaks to me that Mr. Lowe's office was relatively high-stress to her. I'm just being fair here. And if we're saying if you can't take the heat, get out of the kitchen, well, yeah, she resigned. She left on her own volition. And her complaint was that she was pushed out, which, with employment law in the UK, you cannot do that. So Woman B was in a slightly different position. She only worked at the constituency office, and her essential complaint is that she was treated quite differently and discriminatorily from others like Liam Porter or indeed Mr. Wedden himself. In her case, and after the continual complaints, matters came to a head when she had been criticised for not accessing earlier case information for guidance and ensuring that new complaint did not already have a file. When she did exactly that and found an earlier case that involved her own family, she was criticised for a data breach. Even to me this sounds unreasonable, again, if these claims are true. The earlier case was closed by the time that she had accessed it, and by way of contrast, Mr. Wedden had openly discussed a case accessed by him with which had involved her own neighbours. Woman B found herself under constant pressure and criticism. Again, she's claiming this. Like Woman A, she felt that she could do nothing right. The criticism came from both Alistair Harrison and Joss Wedden. Woman B had a sense of inconsistency in respect of what had been levelled against her, as opposed to conduct tolerated and accepted by others in the office. Again, claims by her. For Mr. Lowe, it must be acknowledged that at a disciplinary hearing attended by himself and HR, Woman B appeared to be accepting responsibility for accessing the former case file, but she explains that in a statement she felt compelled to fall on her sword because she had factually accessed the material and she hoped that by accepting responsibility she could start with a clean slate and keep her job. In her statement, she considers that she was deliberately manoeuvred into her admissions, which, importantly, whether this breach even amounted to a disciplinary matter in the context set out, should have something about which Mr. Lowe could have taken a view. However, and I was thinking this, I am unimpressed by any HR presence at the hearing, as it is fairly common knowledge that the HR department in any institution setting is there for the institution and not for the employees. Yeah, that's definitely true. I have had to deal with HR in the past. They are there to represent the company, not the employees. And so effectively it was Mr. Lowe and HR versus this woman. And so what effectively she's saying here is that she can believe that this woman B was manoeuvred into admitting fault when, from the sounds of it, if she was told to find earlier case files, goes through it and finds her own, then gets blamed for a data breach, there's clearly supposed to be representation on her side beyond herself if they're bringing HR into this. That is indeed quite odd. In the case of woman B, another issue arises. She had been furnished with what can only be described as unacceptable remarks made about her from the very inception of her job. These were made by the way of WhatsApp messages from Jonathan Whedon to woman B, who has been the source of providing these messages. Mr. Whedon made pejorative, derogatory and offensive comments about woman B, describing her as weird, who cares, even referencing autism, that's where it gets worse, and wanting to shake her off, as in get rid of her, I assume. These texts are all annexed to woman B's statement, and they do not make for comfortable reading. I would like to see those messages, but unfortunately they were not attached. And I see a lot of people focusing in on, oh, she was just called weird and didn't like it. No, I'm not going to lie. Referencing autism and openly saying they want to shake her off, as in possibly get rid of her, yeah, I'm not being funny. That is absolutely not going to fly in any workplace. I have worked in plenty myself, and being open about wanting to get rid of someone like that while they can see it, not a great look. Mr. Lowe's response to me was that he very properly deplored these messages once he had seen them. In other words, even Mr. Lowe thinks these are really bad, but he could not see how he could be responsible for what his constituency manager had done without his knowledge, which is fair enough. I will explore that response when I come to look at legal positions, but there are two further comments that need to be made in respect of woman B and her effective claim of discriminatory conduct against her. The first is that Mr. Lowe had been asked by me in writing, and as one of my questions submitted to his solicitor, whether once he did know of these texts, whether he took disciplinary action against Mr. Whedon for his admittedly unacceptable conduct in the workplace against a subordinate. The statement continues, I've received no response to this, and whilst I do not wish to second guess any fact, nothing was said to me by Mr. Lowe about his taking such action against Mr. Whedon, in contrast to the speed with which he acted against both woman A and woman B. I rather suspect that no formal disciplinary steps whatsoever have been taken against Mr. Whedon. Nothing has been suggested by Mr. Lowe in his many statements to the media that he has accepted that these texts were put out, and that he has consequently taken the appropriate action against his constituency manager in respect of unacceptable behaviour. Indeed, I do not recall him in any of his posts referencing this conduct on the part of his constituency manager toward and in respect of a junior female employee. Let's just make it absolutely clear as well. He was on Dan Wootton going through what he thought was the evidence for bullying, and one thing he mentioned was, oh, someone called some counsellor a silly tart or something like that. No, it turns out that there were, well, things that could easily break the Equality Act 2010 in here, which, as I say, is ridiculous legislation. It's stuff that Mr. Lowe has apparently said is deplorable as well. He admits that these are bad texts. Didn't bring it up in Dan Wootton's show. And not only that, he keeps claiming that there's no evidence of bullying, despite the fact that he has openly said these were deplorable texts. As I have to say over and over again, Rupert Lowe cannot keep his story straight, and there has now been 2 direct instances in this report of Rupert Lowe misleading us. And I'll go through it, but even today he keeps saying there's no evidence of bullying. There never was bullying. This statement is pretty damning on that fact, isn't it? Anyway, the second is that Liam Porter, I am told, represented Mr. Lowe at a parliamentary function at which he became embarrassingly drunk and incapable. He did not face any disciplinary action for this conduct. Not sure who told her that. I don't know if that's true either, but again, if true, pretty damning and does actually show direct discriminatory behaviour, whether it's based on sex, whether it's based on her having autism or whatever. That is that is where the problem will come in. You can't do that in a workplace. Doesn't matter how ridiculous you think the law is, that is the law. And if this comes back to bite Reform UK, it's a really bad look for them. Finally, and almost in passing, it has been noted that woman B informed Weddon that she suffered from dyspraxia, and further, she had also suffered a family bereavement when she lost her brother in tragic circumstances and was helping her obviously distraught mother. The dyspraxia is a protected characteristic under the provision of the Equality Act 2010. So it's also nothing to do with autism, oddly enough. But yeah, again, with that ridiculous legislation, you just have to avoid making any reference to any stated, especially stated characteristic like that. I need to add, as can be seen below, as we'll go into the law bit, that if this discrimination was being meted out to both of these women in contradistinction to the men working in the office, then that too could also amount to a breach of the 2010 Act. On this point, since it's been brought up, a lot of people seem to be bringing up that, Reform wants to get rid of, or at least, at the very least, change the Equality Act, which I do too. And for some reason, people are saying, why are they using it for lawfare? Isn't that hypocritical? And no, you're missing the point of why this has all happened. The reason Reform are going so hard on trying to get this whole thing sorted out properly is to avoid any sort of other lawfare. They have to do this, otherwise they are liable to unlimited fines due to workplace bullying legislation that invoke the Equality Act. Because they are doing this, it does not mean that they are then not going to change the Equality Act. Just because they're against a law does not mean they don't need to comply with said law. I don't know why this has to be mentioned, but, if you watched the stream yesterday, you will probably know that I'm very, very disenfranchised with an awful lot of people that I used to respect in online communities, because they are making stupid arguments like this. Anyway, I won't waste any more time, because we're half an hour into this and we're still not done with the report. So now we come on to legal implications. I say at once, whilst employment law does not now form any large part of my specialist practice, I do have experience in the field and I have been able to do the necessary research and fully take on board the up-to-date and relevant provisions of the Equality Act 2010. And she goes on to say this is not to try and help the women bring reform to a tribunal, but to advise reform. An employer is liable for acts of discrimination, harassment and victimisation carried out by its employees in the course of employment. Anything done by person A in the course of A's employment must be treated and also done by the employer, or employers, of the Equality Act 2010. It matters not whether that thing is done with the employer's knowledge or approval, but an employer has a defence where it can show that it took all reasonable steps to prevent the employee from carrying out the acts of discrimination. So when considering an employer's defence that it took all reasonable steps to prevent an employee discriminating against another employee, it is legitimate to consider how effective the steps that have been taken were likely to be when they were taken and how effective they have proved in practice. First is the issue of who is the employer. Mr. Lowe suggested that he is not the employer of either woman A or B because they are not contracted to and paid for. They are contracted to and paid for by Parliament. It is likely, however, that he would indeed be regarded as the employer, since, long story short, both these women would not have a job when Rupert Lowe, or if Rupert Lowe loses his seat. Therefore, it's reasonable to call him their employer because, well, 1, he is at the end of the day their manager, 2, he signs their contracts, and 3, their very job's existence is reliant on him being an MP. It needs to be said that the threshold for finding unfair or discriminatory treatment of an employee under Section 28 is very low. This is another thing you need to realise with this report. It's actually quite a criticism of the Equality Act, and I genuinely would not be surprised if Reform actually used this very report to say, look, the Equality Act's mental. Even KCs are admitting that the bar is very low for something that's considered discriminatory or harassment. If the bullying conduct can be related to the sex or disability suffered by an employee, this would likely amount to harassment. You've got to bear in mind as well that the Equality Act has allowed for next and Asda workers to basically claim that because they work on the shop floor, and that's typically women's work, that they should be paid as much as man's work in the warehouse. And basically everyone I ask about this thinks that's an absolutely ridiculous claim, but that's how crazy the Equality Act is. Mr. Lowe has been responsible for setting the tone of his office and constituency office, and thus he's responsible for the acts of both Wedden and Harrison towards woman A and B, as well as looking at his own conduct towards woman A. In my questions to Mr. Lowe, I asked him as to his familiarity with the parliamentary codes that are explicit about bullying in the workplace. I understand that as a new MP, he would have attended such a seminar about these matters, but he declined to address the topic at all. In the recent case in the Employment Appeal Tribunal, it was found that when looking at any reasonableness of the steps an employer has taken, merely asking whether there has been any training is not enough. It is the nature of that training and the likely effectiveness to which it is important. And that's it for the law section. And from what I can tell, as I say, it seems a bit of a criticism of the Equality Act. And given that she said the bar is very low, I am going to take that as a hint that, yes, this probably would constitute bullying. Is it ridiculous? Also probably yes. Woman A I'm not so sure on, and Woman B seemed to go through some similar but not as aggressive problems, but unfortunately she also has the WhatsApp messages, which even Mr. Lowe said looked pretty bad. So, yeah. Not looking good. So finally, let's go through the conclusions. Going back to my own remit and drawing the facts together from both sides as well as the law, I can conclude as follows. There is veracity in the complaints from both women, which amounts credible evidence, to use Mr. Lowe's own words, and these complaints of victimisation, constant criticism, discriminatory behaviour do seem to amount to harassment on the part of both Mr. Lowe and his constituency team, especially Mr. Whedon and Mr. Harrison. My comments on this would be the credible evidence is obviously the WhatsApp chats. There is also evidence that Mr. Lowe found these WhatsApp chats deplorable, and then post then, there has been, from what I can tell, or at least there's been no claim of disciplinary action against Mr. Wedden for his actions in the WhatsApp chat. Which I know the common complaint is, well, is it reasonable for WhatsApp chats to really come under public scrutiny like this? And I do largely agree, which is why Reform wants to change the law, by the way. The problem you have, though, is that clearly this is law. And breaking law. A law where the government or parliament or courts or whichever you want to pick can instigate unlimited fines. And as clearly stated, this can go all the way to the top. If the very top haven't done what they can to deal with these toxic environments, they are liable. That means Reform as a whole is liable. This is why they're taking it so seriously. Anyway, carrying on, moreover, he seems to have failed to understand that it was his duty and responsibility to ensure systems were in place to avoid junior members of staff being treated in any unfair or discriminatory way. Which, as we've gone through, it is. It's also Reforms, hence they're doing this. The failures on the part of the women that have been highlighted by Mr. Lowe and resulted in disciplinary procedures being taken against them seem flimsy in the extreme and would have been unlikely, in my opinion, to have warranted disciplinary action, much less dismissal. They have the appearance of a defensive stance taken once the complaints had been made as the timing support. Which is funny because that's been my complaint of Lowe this whole time. You turn this whole thing on its head and it looks like Mr. Lowe's being the defensive one, but trying to make a narrative that actually it's them being defensive because basically he's good at his job or doing what he should. But having been in the workplace for some time, the data breach mistake really doesn't seem like it should end up in a disciplinary. The only time I've ended up in a disciplinary was basically because I was accused of not turning up at work because I work from home. But I had an entire, my girlfriend calls it a CYA folder or cover your arse folder, where basically you have proof of things that you've been asked to do and then proof of things that you have done these things and done them in a timely manner. Because then when you're accused of not doing your job or something like that, you can just show them this folder and say, see, timestamps, all that sort of thing. And I could show them this during it wasn't quite a disciplinary hearing, but it was a meeting with HR. And obviously no further action is taken. But being accused of not doing your job, fairly reasonable. Being told to do your job and then having a disciplinary for that, yeah, very odd. That's my take on this. But again, you're only hearing, it's fair to point out, you're only hearing the woman's side from this. But then that makes it even more odd that Rupert Lowe isn't bothering with any of this, so you're only going to get a one-sided story. And I'm not being funny, but going through this, I have even less sympathy for Mr. Lowe's I'm being politically attacked here stance. Again, as I've gone through, the women made complaints. If Reform don't do anything about these complaints that have been made to them on the 27th of February, they're as liable as Mr. Lowe for these issues. At the very least, Mr. Lowe should have taken seriously the distress and concerns of a seasoned parliamentary employee and of both women. That's certainly true. 14 years experience, and she's basically saying this is not normal parliamentary office procedure, and it's incredibly poor work, yeah, I'd probably take that seriously. You've hired someone for their experience on the recommendation of someone else. I think that's fair enough to take her concern seriously. If he felt that either did fall short of what was expected of them by him or his senior staff, then a careful and full meeting to discuss, by way of appraisal, what may have gone wrong and how it could be improved could have been undertaken before immediate disciplinary action was sought. That's, again, being in the workplace for some time, yeah, that's what I would expect. This contrasts with a failure to take action or indeed investigate complaints against two men in the constituency office and against Mr. Harrison, who formed part of the team. Which, again, they may have done that, but they need to show evidence for it, but none of them decided to get involved with this. I've indicated in my discussion of the law above that I'm of the view that there is a real risk that acts if complained of, if made out, could well give rise to breaches in the Equality Act 2010. So, not that they do, that's not what she's saying, but there is a real risk should the women want to take them forward. And Reform want to avoid that for reasons I've mentioned earlier. The consequences will be a matter for the women to take such advice and action as they consider fit, but a factor in this is the allegation by woman A, I assume it might be B, of threats, in brackets, made by on behalf of Rupert Lowe to take action himself against her if she cooperated with the investigation, which, at least if true, are both unhelpful and unedifying. I take on board that he has denied that such threats have been made. I'm just going to be real with you here. Every other tweet from Rupert Lowe threatens legal action. I would not be surprised if he also threatens legal action in real life. However, as I always say, this is an allegation, needs to be looked into, can't make any conclusive points on this right now. However, since everyone else is making character assessments of Rupert Lowe, I'm going to add my own in. Anyway, to finish off the report, going forward I would advise the party hierarchy to be quite strict about ensuring that each member of the party is fully acquitted with the rules of Parliament as regards bullying and the provisions of the 2010 Act, given, I repeat, this is a really low threshold to be crossed to be able to bring such a claim against a member. The party wants to avoid any such unpleasantness, not just due to the risk of legal action, but also out of common decency and respect for another person who is doing his or her best to do a good job. I will say that's a very odd comment at the end, saying that people are trying to do the best to do a good job. Bit of a weird emotional ending there, I'd say. But I don't think it detracts too much from the rest of the paragraph, which I completely understand. Reform don't want to get in legal battles with their own employees, because lawfare can absolutely bring a party down. Hell, it happened to the BNP. And so they're going to do everything they can to avoid it. Again, this is why they have done this. You, by law, have to do everything you can to stop a toxic work environment, stop an environment of bullying, and stop your employees being harassed. If it cannot be shown that you are doing what you can to deal with this harassment and bullying, then you're screwed as a company. You know, there have been stories of people getting tens of thousands of pounds in rebate for being called an idiot once. And it sounds like that actually it's been on multiple occasions that this has happened. You know, putting people into disciplinary action for mild screw-ups in their job, which is what it looked like the women did, that can be considered harassment, especially if you're being so lenient on other members of your team. The Equality Act comes into it largely, I think, because of the perceived notion that, oh, it's because they're women that this is happening and the men are getting away with it. Which, you know, there may be other women in the team. I'm not sure, but anyway, for now, I think I've made my points on this. It doesn't look great for Rupert Lowe, as the bullying claims are largely substantiated. They were brought up multiple times. There is no denial from that, from what I can see. Even on Dan Wootton's show, Rupert Lowe said that some complaints were made, so it's not going to look great if he starts denying there was ever bullying. Anyway, he instantly came out with quite a lengthy tweet, though I would imagine that this was actually made by his internal contractor, or independent contractor. I've been told that the reform investigation is going to be released prior to a deadline given to my lawyer. The reform investigation has not spoken to me nor my team. So here is my report on the unfounded claims of bullying in my office. Again, you can't claim they're unfounded when you yourself have seen the WhatsApp messages and you yourself called them deplorable. That's not going to end well. I've gone through the evidence that has finally arrived from the reform investigation, so let's take a look at it. I'm not going through this whole thing. You can read this in your own time. I am at a point where I just do not trust a single thing that Rupert Lowe puts on his own account, given that he doesn't actually put it on his own account, his independent contractor does. So one of the primary complaints, to give you an idea of the veracity of allegations, following a conversation about a standard constituent issue, an email with contact details one of the complaints was expecting was forwarded to her from a colleague with no subject line or context. She felt this was an instance of rudeness and undermining. Apparently, the unspoken subtext of the blank email was to "look what you have done." Again, I've said this before, but every time this stuff comes up, Rupert Lowe has a completely different story to go through, and it's why I'm basically not going to bother going through a lot more of this response, because as far as I can tell, there was nothing in the report that we've just gone through the whole of to even bring up a time like this. Effectively, what Rupert Lowe's independent contractor is trying to do here is effectively say, oh, they were just having woman moments. And whether you think she was or not, the problem is that you can't really imply she's having woman moments, because, again, that would be breaking the Equality Act 2010. And again, I am effectively having to compare a KC who has seen a whole load of evidence and, although we can't see it ourselves yet, has attached literal WhatsApp messages and emails to her report, compared with the, frankly, no evidence we get from Rupert Lowe and we trust his word on it. I have gone through multiple videos on this. I have done hours of content on this. I have come to the conclusion that you cannot trust what Rupert Lowe is saying. He has misled you. It has confirmed he has misled you. It has been confirmed in the report he has misled you. And so I can only assume that there's a pattern going on, that Rupert Lowe is trying to mislead me again. So I'm not going to bother going on beyond this. He says he goes through the evidence, and then he brings up something that isn't even within the evidence. What am I supposed to take from that? He's trying to obfuscate. There are people that will only read Rupert Lowe's tweets here, rather than the actual report, and I'm not here to do that. I am here to try and give you a fair understanding of what's going on. And as much as it might annoy a lot of you, I am at a point where there's no point going through Rupert Lowe's tweets anymore. I cannot trust them. Why would I report on things I cannot trust? I will just quickly mention this bit though. The other complaint talked of micromanaging from a colleague who raised legitimate issues about her work maybe 2 or 3 times in 6 months, not even working from the same geographic location. Both complaints only raised these allegations once the disciplinary proceedings had started against them for multiple serious offences. Again, I've gone through the whole report. Total nonsense. Total nonsense. He's just misleading you again. Stop trusting him. Stop taking him at his word. And an awful lot of the rest of it is just Rupert Lowe basically saying that yes, he was dismissing her complaints and just completely dismissed them, which again is not going to look good in any case about, well, workplace problems. So it's the blank email, look at what you have done instance. Another incident of rudeness was when she asked somebody to move information from WhatsApp to email and a colleague said to her it's easier if you do it, as it was also her responsibility. She said it was an insult to her intelligence that she was asked not to disclose confidential information to individuals outside the office. She complained that more experienced members of the team conducted regular reviews of her casework with constituents and brought up issues. My team checks work, particularly from an individual who has just started employment and was evidently struggling. So my whole issue with this whole thing, frankly, is if you have defences for all this, why are you throwing them out to Twitter after all this has been done, rather than making your case to the KC to help her understand what's going on? Oh, because I don't trust her. Okay, that was a stupid move. And also further down in the tweet it goes on about she was sacked for gross misconduct. If you can actually prove gross misconduct, you can actually undermine all these bullying claims. But again, the whole narrative that, oh, all these complaints were made in reaction to disciplinary proceedings, which, granted, the KC has mainly only heard one side of the story. However, she's heard one side of the story with emails and WhatsApp as evidence, so it's not like it's unsubstantiated. Plus, there will be records of these meetings with HR and all that. There's way more to trust on that side of the aisle than Rupert Lowe, who's just thrown this all out to Twitter in the hopes that we all believe it. And I'm sorry, I've been beyond the point of believing Rupert Lowe's word for probably a week and a half at this point. Because, again, I need to lay this on really thick, because I know the comments I get, and I understand why I get these comments, but I'm just so fed up with it. Rupert was happy to go on Dan Wootton's show and talk about all the evidence and, it's the truth behind all this, and none of this came up. Absolutely none of it came up. His point was, someone in my office called some counsellor a silly tart and someone didn't like that. And now it's coming out with all this micromanaging stuff, and they're all in response to their disciplinary action, which again, it turns out from the timeline, not true at all. The story changes every time. More information comes out, the story changes from Rupert Lowe. How am I supposed to trust a man like that? I don't understand why so many people are trusting him too. And so I'm done with it. But anyway, moving off from this lengthy reply and response, Rupert Lowe made another tweet. Or sorry, his independent contractor made another tweet. So once again, he's claiming that there was no bullying, there never has been any bullying. Using such claims to damage me through my staff is shameful. To say that I have threatened legal action against these women is an outright lie, despite the fact he threatens legal action against everyone else. Both of these, again, there's no proof he did threaten legal action against them. I just would not be surprised if he did. Both these complainants admitted to serious offences. Both only they weren't I'm sorry. I have worked in offices for nigh on 10 years now. These were not serious offences. Drafting of an employment document that you didn't read and sign off on, that is only your fault. Having her go through your email when she could literally have only got the information to that email account from you is not a serious disciplinary matter. That is you making a mistake and having to change the password if you didn't actually want it. And being told to look at earlier cases and coming across one that involved your own family, which could include a data breach, I can understand that. But again, completely unreasonable to have a proper disciplinary gross misconduct meeting for it. That's absurd. And also, these disciplinary processes were after they had started making complaints directly to Rupert Lowe. So I'm not having this. I'm not having this at all. Once again, if he had such robust defences, why would he not make them within the independent investigation? As far as I'm concerned, there's only one reason he wouldn't do that, and that's because he's talking nonsense here yet again. I'm done with it. I have little charity to give Rupert Lowe at this point. Anyway, he then claims that Reform deployed woke HR lawfare to smear not only his name, but the reputation of my innocent and decent staff, going as far as to publicly name them, which is apparently unprecedented wickedness and truly despicable behaviour, and he's ashamed to have been part of such a rotten organisation. You know you don't have a right to anonymity in cases like this, right? The only time you get automatic anonymity is if you are under 18 and involved in a court case, or you are the victim of a sexual crime. If you're an adult, you basically have no right to anonymity. Like, everyone knows when you're accused. And this is odd for another reason, because Lowe's independent contractor did go around for a while replying to Reform saying you're a disgrace for publicly naming and endangering my staff, which is such a ridiculous statement, because 2 weeks ago, about 4 days after this all became public, Rupert Lowe got his team, well, I say got his team decided, because again, independent contractor, one of the names here, decided to throw out this public statement trying to claim there was never any bullying in the office and things like that. All the names are there of his staff, all of them, as far as I can tell. Now you'll notice that these people saying that there was never any bullying are the exact same people being accused of bullying. You've got John Whedon in there, Alistair Harrison, these are people involved with the case, And so, as much as everyone's been trying to say, oh, these people all came out and said he's actually really nice and there was no bullying going on, yeah, they have direct interest to say that. So I take this with as much salt as any other he said, she said type of scenarios in this entire case. But one thing I did also notice is that some of the names mentioned here actually also don't indicate that they're married. So Alistair Harrison and Katrina Petrenko, they're married, as it was pointed out in the report. And Katrina's used her maiden name. Not to look too deeply into this is just a bit of a nitpick on my end, but it does also look quite odd to me that they are trying to hide the fact that two of these people are married in this particular statement, which doesn't bode well for me taking the statement particularly seriously. But as I have said throughout this, I'm going to trust the report from a KC who has the most incentive to not lie, because she can lose her livelihood by lying, than I do with Rupert Lowe, who has made it quite clear over the past couple of weeks that his main mission has effectively been to be Ben Habib's envoy within Reform, and then when they cottoned on to that, try and damage them as much as possible. And with open talks now of them thinking about starting a new party, or the open door being there for the Tories, there's even more reason to try and discredit Reform. That's how I'm going to put that. And for the sake of fairness, is there incentive for Reform to lie about Rupert Lowe? Well, there certainly has been since they've been openly attacking him, ever since that Daily Mail article, sure. And he even tweets out the timeline that the Daily Mail interview was done on the 25th. Farage's team was made aware of that interview on the 26th. How exactly they were made aware, I have absolutely no idea. However, these complaints by the two separate women were raised to the party chair the day after. which as far as I'm aware from the past, they were not aware of these bullying incidents before. So is it a case that they sat on them and waited for a time where it's reasonable to kick Rupert Lowe out, or Rupert Lowe's causing too much drama? Yeah, maybe. Thing is, though, I was told right from the start these are trumped up charges. No, been through the report in this video, not trumped up. We can have claims that the law's ridiculous, I'm totally fine with that, but as far as I'm concerned, it's not unreasonable to say that there is a genuine risk that it broke the law of the Equality Act, which, yes, they want to get rid of, probably for this exact situation, I'm not going to lie. However, it's still going to be law, I would imagine, that not dealing with bullying properly is going to lead to tribunals and money being taken off employers to go to employees. Yes, it's very employee-sided, yes, I do agree with that. Problem is, you're still at the behest of the law, and you do not want the party coming under scrutiny for not doing anything about bullying, given it's completely toppled MPs before. Anyway, these complaints were made to the independent parliamentary body, earlier in the month or the month before. Cool, the Reform Party don't necessarily know that, though. But yes, I can understand why this all looks suspicious, and as I say, I'm not even against the idea that Reform might have sat on these until now. But hell, that's politics for you. You brief against the party, of course you're going to end up in the mud. What more do you expect? This is why you've got to keep your nose clean. And hell, Reform probably could have done this privately and quietly. In fact, from the looks of it, they were doing it privately and quietly until obviously Rupert Lowe came out with that Daily Mail article. But you can't claim that these are trumped up. These were real complaints. They had to be investigated. Even if it turned out Rupert Lowe did nothing wrong, they still need to be investigated. And the statement Reform gave seemed largely to follow what the report said. As I say, I had an issue that they said that Lowe made threats, legal threats, to one of the women because that's purely down to her claim. Sure, you can't say that, fine. But you're focusing on point 3 when there were 3 other points that were substantiated. So again, he's in the mud and he's still mouthing off on Twitter as if that's helped him at all so far. What it gets him is Twitter likes and praise from the online right. Great, well done. Best of luck to you. I don't think it's going to get you very far. He also then goes on to say that his lawyer communicated with the KC and she did not give her permission for the report to be published today. I was absolutely not responsible for the release of that report. She wants to respect the agreed deadline. Reform have acted shamefully. Again, the lawyer having this is the deadline to release it. This was published earlier than that deadline. I am not responsible for the release of the report is not the same as not giving permission for the report to be published. Within his own tweet, he can't keep the story straight. That's a step up from what I've been complaining about before. This is the exact same tweet that is Guardian tier contradictory. Anyway, his final point on Twitter, I've just spoken to the parliamentary authorities about the disgraceful harassment and intimidation of my innocent staff through this reform report. I don't think anyone cares, man. Their names and the report were released without the KC's permission today. Nope. Not necessarily without the KC's permission. The KC had a deadline. She was expecting it to be released. It was earlier. That is not the same as not getting permission to release it. I'm not being funny. Reform are playing this to the point of not doing anything to break the law. And frankly, I would not be surprised if the KC's given advice on this. She probably said, throw out the report on this day. For whatever reason, redact this and that. You don't have to redact the accused names. Oh, can we release it as soon as possible? Yeah, I guess, but I wouldn't. That's what this conversation is, and Rupert Lowe is once again taking a ridiculous position on it. And again, as I said before, it doesn't help him, but people just gobble up his tweets. And I think it's absurd that people keep doing that. My staff have also spoken to the police tonight and have been invited to express their understandable worries, and reports have been made. Okay, I'd like to see how that goes in the news. Parliamentary security are concerned and are now involved with my staff. None of this is acceptable. Dragging my staff into this mess to smear my name is desperate and disgusting. I'm sorry, I have no sympathy for that point. They put themselves in the firing line when they wrote out that statement saying there was no bullying going on. And in the report, it turns out actually some of the people were involved with it, with evidence of WhatsApp and emails. So I don't know how well that's going to go down. Anyway, he claims to have never seen anything so professional and such vile behaviour, and I would probably agree with him. His own behaviour has been pretty bad, but obviously that's not what he's talking about. Right, quickly touching upon how this has affected Reform UK, from what I can tell, with Ben Habib and Howard Cox and a load of other ex-UKippers who've all come out of the woodwork to complain about Farage, along with all the attacks from mainstream and establishment sources as well, from the Tories and newspapers and things like that. Quite clear to me this is a concerted effort to try and, damage Reform's credibility. Fine, okay, if they deserve to lose credibility, they can certainly try and attack that. However, the worst damage they've had is coming down in the YouGov poll by 5 points. That is definitely the worst that they've had. That is coming down from an unusually high 27% to 22%, which puts them in line with the Tory party, with Labour just ahead. Might be vice versa there, I can't remember. In another poll, they have gone down by 1 point. Again, mostly in line with Labour, Tories and Reform. Every other poll, they've either been even or gone up by 1 or 2. What I can tell from average there is that there has been slight damage. I don't think anyone's denying that. My point is that the damage has been fairly small. They took a bit of a hit of numbers, people constantly posting that they're leaving the party on Twitter. It turns out that the numbers have stabilised and they're still just under 22,000 members, where they have been for some time. There has not been a mass exodus. Support for Reform is largely where it was a month ago. Reform have an absolutely massive conference coming up at the end of the week, and it's quite clear to me that everything that has been going on has been to attack Reform to make that a bit of a failure. It doesn't look like that's going to happen. The attack on Reform has simply not worked. If you want to call this an attack on Lowe, I'm fine with that. It has worked much better. My conclusions on this whole saga so far have been that Rupert Lowe, with all his mouthing of, with all his legal threats, with his constant change in story from his independent contractor on Twitter, screamed to me that his plan for some time has been to undermine the party. This comes from the little nuggets of claims that we get from Reform whenever they talk about Rupert Lowe. All they really have to say is that he was a bit of a pain. And as I've said in earlier videos, the Daily Mail article was largely just parroting Ben Habib's problems, and from a lot of people I follow on Twitter, they seem to have issues with Ben Habib's criticisms, and for some reason when Rupert Lowe did it, all of a sudden it was legitimate, and obviously it's an attack on him for that. Behind the scenes, he will have been largely the same. A pain, and making... I see a lot of people saying, why don't you see it as legit criticism? It's that type of pointless criticism that's like telling footballers to score goals. Yeah, that's obviously the entire goal, but they don't always score goals in the first 5 minutes of a match. It's just a pointless criticism, and Gawain Towler on every interview he's been on has made this same point. Yeah, obviously, Rupert, we do need a crack team. Yeah, obviously, Rupert, we do need policy. That sort of stuff comes later down the line when you're close to an election. Barely any of us knew who was going to be on Trump's team in 2020. Basically, none of us did. And then when it came to 2024, everyone's complimenting how crack the team is. A lot of them are ex-Democrats, and for some reason they're all complaining also that ex-Tories are joining Reform. I cannot get my head round how little a lot of the online right seem to understand about politics, and this is why I have found myself being disillusioned with them. A lot of people on Twitter, as it was with the left, are just emotionally driven commentators. I try my best to avoid that and give you my largely level-headed commentary on it. Is there stuff that come out that can still undermine Reform? Yes, obviously. The Met Police investigation could come back with absolutely nothing with trumped-up charges, and then that puts Reform in the mud completely. When it comes to this report on the bullying claims, it turns out, yep, the claims can be substantiated. As far as I'm concerned, they were not trumped up, and they had to be looked into by law, because as mentioned, they can technically be done with an unlimited fine. You cannot let something like that go within the party. Yes, they could have done it privately. However, after that absolutely absurd interview that basically called the party a joke, I am absolutely not shocked that they then went public with it all. As far as I can tell, absolutely nobody in Reform is impressed with the way that this has all gone down. There are people who've put their head above the parapet and risked, frankly, their professional lives by openly standing for Reform, and seeing the MPs have this spat in public is highly embarrassing for them and has not done wonders for their faith in the party. However, aside from, I think it's about 10 branches that have openly stated that they've lost people, out of 400, still seems pretty good. It's also worth mentioning those were all interim managers, leaders and officers who were facing votes in August. Because of that, it looks like it's a bit of a I'm walking out before I'm voted out in some of the cases. Not all of them necessarily. But largely, Reform still seems to be going strong. They are still going around and doing what they can to do their best for their elections. And going back to the whole leaked messages with Nigel Farage that everyone says, oh, this was clearly a stitch-up then, something that was pointed out to me by The Spectator, and I really think is worth mentioning, is that Nigel Farage's clear thinking was purely on, this is all for reform, for the party. I just need to get these elections to be the best that they can and get the best result that we can. That's all that matters. Rupert Lowe has undermined that as best he can, and it's awful. And talking to a few people in Reform after those messages came out, that was something a lot of them picked up on. Oh, Nigel Farage is really there to get the party in a position where they can win. He is really for getting Reform on the map and getting Reform in Parliament and making the changes that need to be made. That's really good to see. Rupert Lowe, rightly or wrongly, he has been on Twitter talking about nothing but himself, trying to up his profile and trying to denigrate Reform. Guess which side the members are going on and which side the members are more appreciative of. And then wonder why basically nobody really wants Rupert Lowe back in the party anyway. So with that, that's the end of the video. No doubt I'm going to get a load of comments again, and I welcome criticism, do not worry. I'm sure you've noticed by now that I reply to a fair few comments. And I'm basically at the point where I am quite open that, yes, after this report, I'm quite happy to plant my flag in the Reform side of things. I've tacitly been on that side for a while because Rupert Lowe's given me reason to doubt him. There's reason to doubt Reform as well, don't get me wrong, nobody's perfect. But I'm rarely seeing a statement from Rupert Lowe where I can't find an issue with it. So, well, there we go. Police report, that's the next thing that's coming up. I just cannot see someone like Zahir Yusuf putting £200,000 into Reform UK just to then screw it all up, just because he didn't like Rupert Lowe. I do not see that as a realistic scenario, but who knows, I could be surprised. Anyway, videos are coming out as and when I can make them. There is a stream next Tuesday for Tosh Talks. The poll for the topic will be put in the Worcester Club, so do go join that. If you want to help out the channel, you can become a member, you can give super chats and super thanks. If you can't give me money, that's totally understandable. Just subscribe, leave a comment and a like telling me what you think, because I've no doubt people will have arguments to make, and I welcome them, as I say. There's one thing you cannot say about me, it's that I do not put myself in echo chambers. That is absolutely true, and I hope that's appreciated. Anyway, with that, that's everything I had for you for today. So once again, thank you very much for watching, and until next time, goodbye.